So we left off discussing the Ottoman Empire and Safavid Empire, both, well, the one in a state of decline, the other one had actually been replaced. I think we were up to the Qajar dynasty in Iran, though also both of them being confronted with a kind of growing European presence in the region. And we might say that this really becomes something more serious, beginning with the invasion of Egypt by Napoleon and the French in 1798. A date, actually the date is July 1st, the date is actually seen as kind of marking the beginning of the modern period in Egypt, I should say in the Middle East. And we should point out that the term modern, when used by historians, has a much kind of more precise meaning than how we often use that word in day-to-day language. When we say something is modern, the implication is that it's something maybe invented in the last year. From a historian's perspective, when we talk about the modern period, in the case of Europe, if you're talking about the early modern period, you could go back to the 1400s. In the case of the Middle East, we basically feel that the modern period began in 1798. It's simply kind of indicating that a rather transformative shift in paradigm, way of thinking about the world, but also with respect to certain kinds of developments politically, scientifically, and so forth, that something really dramatic had begun to change. And in the case of the Middle East, up until that point, most people in the Middle East had very, if you were maybe at the among the upper echelons politically in the Ottoman Empire, you had some idea about developments in Europe, but most people in the Middle East had very little awareness of what had been happening over the last few centuries. For most, their kind of, shall we say, historical memory of Europe dated back to the Crusades. And definitely at that time, compared to the Middle East, Europe was a backwater. Right, so I mean, there wasn't any sense that somehow Europe was advancing, perhaps had even passed Middle East or Islamic civilization. So Napoleon's invasion was in many ways a rude awakening regarding the fact that not only had significant developments taken place in Europe in terms of scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, political changes, social changes, and certainly military changes. But there was kind of a feeling suddenly that Europe had just blown by the Middle East. And from that point forward, there's going to be kind of two basic concerns. On the one hand, this kind of feeling that perhaps we can borrow something from Europe or learn something from them in order to advance here. And there's going to be kind of a big debate about, to what extent should we be borrowing from Europe? Should we embrace European culture wholesale, or just borrow certain elements of it that are compatible with our way of life, or perhaps reject it entirely? And then there's, related to that, there was this kind of growing concern about, a fear, shall we say, of European dominance, not just imperially, right, with the kind of European expansion imperially as they begin to create these global empires, but also that they might dominate culturally, economically, and so forth. So all of that kind of begins with the French occupation of Egypt. And you might be wondering, how did that come about? Well, at the time, Napoleon was not yet dictator or ruler of France. He was the head of the French Revolutionary Army in Italy, but very rapidly becoming quite popular and perceived by many in the French government as a potential threat. So when he proposed an expedition to Egypt, which, by the way, I mean, really came out of the blue. No one anticipated this, and historians still debate exactly what motivated Napoleon. A lot of it might have been really about personal glory, kind of saw himself as the second coming of Alexander the Great. But when he proposed this expedition, the French government was like, great, off you go. And so he went there with a sizable army, but also a large number of learned men, shall we say, scholars, or the term they often used was savants. And so they landed on the coast of Egypt on July 1st, 1798, and very quickly took control of Alexandria. A few days later, the kind of decisive battle took place between the French and the Mamluks, who were the regional governors. You might remember that they had continued as a kind of regional elite within Egypt, and in fact, by this time, they were in many ways fairly autonomous. But the battle was decisive: 300 French versus 6,000 Egyptians killed. So in very short order, the French had brought Egypt under their control. Now, as you might imagine, the Egyptians were quite curious about what his intentions were. Napoleon issued proclamations in Arabic, presenting the French as effectively Muslim, claiming great reverence for Muhammad and the Quran. They pointed out that they had overthrown papal authority in Rome, as if somehow being in opposition to the Catholic Church was the same thing as being Muslim. I don't think this was quite a perspective shared in Egypt. They also proclaimed that, as per French revolutionary values, they intended to kind of elevate the Egyptian people against the Mamluk elite. That all men should be seen as equal. That they were kind of here to stand against this kind of hierarchy. The only thing that should set one man apart from another is their own intellectual and moral excellence, whatever merits they might have. We should note that regarding this kind of anti-Catholic position, that did in fact reflect kind of the French Revolution, which embodied many ideas associated with the Enlightenment, tended to be very kind of anti-religion and particularly anti-Catholic Church, but it certainly had nothing to do with embracing Islam. Now, Napoleon also claimed that he was there on behalf of the Ottoman Empire, of the Ottoman Sultan, raising Ottoman and French flags. That he was there to restore Ottoman authority, that the Mamluks had become too independent. All of this would have been great news to the Ottoman Sultan and Ottoman government, who not only did not support this, but had no idea that it was coming. As you might imagine, Egyptians were pretty skeptical. At some point, they send a delegation of local members of the ulama from the Azhar Mas to Napoleon. It's kind of like, all right, fine, we understand like kind of the propaganda part of this. What are you really here for? To which Napoleon responded by repeating the proclamation. They were like, okay, we'll just have to wait and see. And it really was a kind of wait and see attitude, giving the French the benefit of the doubt. The French did set up a municipal council in Cairo with pseudo-elected, appointed delegates from throughout Egypt, but it very quickly became apparent that it was a complete facade, that Egypt would be governed directly by the French by decree, and the job of the municipal council was basically just to give the French decrees their seal of approval, to effectively rubber stamp them. Now we should note that at this point the French had no choice but to remain in Egypt. The French fleet had shown up in the Bay of Aboukir under Horatio Nelson, and they immediately destroyed the entire French fleet, so they were kind of landlocked at this point. And it's going to turn out that conquering Egypt and maintaining control of it are two different things. For one thing, the Mamluk governors had escaped. They were still at large with an army. So as soon as the French would try to move further south into Upper Egypt, or to leave any of the larger population centers, they would frequently be greatly harassed by these armies. And then added to that, a lot of the French reforms were proving very unpopular. So increasingly aspects of French administration were seen as un-Islamic. And I'd like to, kind of suggest that we think of this more as, simply the idea that they seem very alien and foreign, like just different from how we do things here. Not necessarily being about whether they were in fact compatible with Sharia, or, some kind of really official, formal understanding of Islam, and that something the French were doing was wrong, right? It's just simply that they were, over time really made it clear that they were a foreign element. Didn't help that French soldiers were often very disrespectful of Egyptian people in their behavior, kind of walking around like they owned the place. But the thing that finally really turned the Egyptians on the French was the imposition of a house tax, right? So the French imposed a tax on the Egyptian people. And nobody likes being taxed, particularly by a foreign occupying power. It was pretty clear that the point of the tax was to fund the French occupation, and this led to an insurrection headed up by the ulama. So the headquarters of the insurrection was the Azhar Mosque, and the French were able to suppress it pretty easily. I mean, militarily, they were far superior to anything that civilians in Cairo could offer. But I mean, from that point on, it was pretty clear that the French are not welcome. Again, I do want to stress, right? I don't want to exaggerate the role of Islam in this regard, but resistance would have been understood primarily as being religiously motivated rather than nationalistically. There isn't really a strong sensibility at this point in Egypt of being Egyptian. And in fact, nationalism as a way of identifying who you are as part of a larger kind of communal identity is something that is only, at this point, only beginning to take root in many parts of the world, including in Europe. Most historians would argue that nationalism as a way of thinking about who you are as part of a larger group really begins more or less with the French Revolution, right? So this is something that's only just beginning. So the French are, at this point, really not welcome at all. And just to give kind of an indication of, how the French were entirely disrespectful of the Egyptians, they began at this point to use the Azhar Mosque as a stable for their horses. And obviously this is, would have been understood even by the French as a, kind of indication of their disdain for the local inhabitants. In any event, after kind of settling matters in Egypt, Napoleon decides to lead a campaign against the Ottoman Empire. So much for the pretense that they were there on behalf of the Ottoman Empire. This will begin with an invasion of Syria in early 1799 across the Sinai Peninsula, into territory that is, without question, under Ottoman control. And, Napoleon is obviously very famous for his military prowess. And the French go on to win several battles, but they're never really able to consolidate a hold there. For a number of reasons, things kind of come to an end when he's unable to take the city of Acre in northern Palestine. I don't know if you can see it on the map there, but it's kind of very near the top. And that reflects a number of factors. One factor is that the governor of Acre, known as El Jazar, the butcher, we won't really get into that, but you can look him up. But in any event, he proves to be very effective at defending the city, but he does also have the help of the British at this point, who are very concerned that the Ottoman Empire might be threatened. As we're going to find out later, British foreign policy, one major element of it is the idea that the Ottoman Empire must be preserved at all costs. It's a simple balance of power issue, the feeling that if the Ottoman Empire were to go down, one country in particular, namely Russia, would benefit greatly. So we kind of see that. It's really just beginning to be formulated at this point, but we see that kind of policy coming into play. Really, though, ultimately the thing that defeated Napoleon was the plague, which took out a lot of his men. Eventually, they had to retreat. There was also some issues of poor supply lines. But in any event, what we see here is a makeshift hospital used to quarantine soldiers who had caught the plague. What I love about this painting, in the center we see Napoleon literally embracing his men who have the plague. And I can't think of a better indication of his own self-image, that he really felt he was destined for greatness and therefore could not die. So you can't fault him for lack of boldness. In any event, shortly after that, word gets to Napoleon that something is brewing in Paris, that there is a plot to initiate a coup against the government, and there are people who want him to lead it. And literally, in the dead of night in August of 1799, he slips out of Egypt. His men don't even know it. They wake up the next morning to find him gone. And off he goes to Paris, where he leads a military coup seizing power on the 18th of Brumaire by the French Revolutionary calendar. That would be December 8th, 1799, on the traditional or more conventional calendar. Well, in any event, to make a long story short, once he is gone, It's only a matter of time before the French are driven out of Egypt. They're being continually harassed by not only Ottoman forces at this point, but British ones as well. And eventually, after losing about 13,500 more men, mostly to disease, but also in battle, the French finally capitulate, relinquishing control of Egypt in August of 1801, with their army being repatriated on British ships to Europe without their weapons. Thus ends the French occupation of Egypt. But before we move forward, I did want to note one very important aspect of it that I very briefly mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, that the French had brought with them a large number of learned men, scholars or savants, if you will. And you might be asking yourself, why were they there? Well, Napoleon often styled himself a son of the Enlightenment, as somebody who had embraced the values of the Enlightenment, which a big part of was just knowledge for the sake of knowledge. So, to some degree, he was probably sincere, but this also was a kind of propaganda, right? To bring all these scholars to Egypt, essentially to study Egypt in depth, and they actually end up publishing the results of their studies in 9 huge volumes, like almost the size of boxes, each one. And they're basically studying and writing about every aspect of Egypt, whether it's the present-day culture at that point, Islamic civilization, the flora, the fauna, the geography, the geology, the nature, certainly the ancient Egyptian culture, and so forth. And you might be wondering what that image is on the right. That is, in fact, the very famous Rosetta Stone, which was discovered by a French soldier in the small Egyptian town of Rosetta. And what you had there was the same thing written 3 times over from the Hellenistic period, a decree from the ruler, written in Greek, written in ancient Egyptian in Greek letters, and then at the bottom, written in hieroglyphics. And until then, nobody knew how to read hieroglyphics, and by using this is kind of almost, languages have structure, and if you kind of know what the entirety of something is saying, and you can kind of like connect different words from one language to another, you could effectively crack the code. And so eventually a team of scholars were able to do that. Okay, so that's a bit of an aside. From the Egyptian point of view, many of these French scholars did make a rather strong impression. So they set up a research institute in Cairo, and you started to see a fairly large number of learned Egyptians, members of the ulama, who started hanging around. And were quite interested in learning about developments in Europe. For instance, they had brought a printing press, something that no one had seen yet, and so that proved very fascinating. So in a way, kind of whetting the appetite to learn more about developments in Europe, right? So that becomes at least one inspiration in that regard. So what happens after the French leave? Well, to make a long story short, the Ottoman are going to try to reassert their authority much more directly in Egypt. They send an army, and a lot of fighting takes place between different factions, including the Mamluks. Eventually, one figure, an Albanian soldier, emerges as the new ruler, and this is in 1805. And he will govern Egypt as, in theory, he represents Ottoman authority as a viceroy or governor. So he will govern from 1805 until 1848. But in actual practice, from this point on, Egypt is pretty much independent, even if nominally recognizing Ottoman authority in the Ottoman Sultan. And this fellow is Muhammad Ali. Nothing to do with Cassius Clay. It's not an uncommon combination of names in Muslim-majority countries. But in any event, he is the original, the first very famous Muhammad Ali, and he has a plan. He wants a modern European-style army, and he recognizes that he has much to learn from Europe. He also recognizes that it's not simply about military technology and recruiting men, that this would really require the wholesale transformation of Egypt in terms of its modernization, very much along European lines. So he's going to become very, very active in developing Egypt in this regard. A lot of this will involve simply building infrastructure, massive new constructions. One example would be the Muhammad Ali Mosque, which you can visit in Cairo today in the Citadel. But more important, and really you cannot lose sight of this, he wants a European-style army. Everything else is a means to an end, but he does realize that reforms must be much more extensive than what are purely military reforms. And a lot of this is going to involve borrowing from Europe, learning from Europe. So on the one hand, he's going to bring in large numbers of foreign instructors from Europe. Initially, it's going to be primary French to help teach Egyptians, the kind of skills that they need. But he's also going to send Egyptians abroad, again, mostly to France, Paris in particular. So, this is all about helping to educate Egyptians that could then hold important positions in government and help to bring about the reforms that he wants. Now, from a pretty early point, he realizes that there are going to be those who resist what he wants to do. In particular, he feels there are two groups that are going to get in the way. One is the ulama, and the other are the Mamluks. Well, first of all, consider he wants to build a modern European-style army, which means it would be based on infantry, which would undermine the preeminent position of the Mamluk, who primarily fight on horseback, right? So they recognize that this kind of goes against their interests. But unfortunately for them, Muhammad Ali anticipated this even before they understood what was happening, and he has them massacred in 1811. The story behind that's kind of interesting. He basically invites them to a celebratory feast in honor of the appointment of his son-in-law Ibrahim Pasha to head up a military expedition. The feast will take place in the Citadel, which is a kind of walled fortress that had been built by Salah ad-Din back in the day. So basically, as soon as they enter the kind of open area when you first come in, he has the gates shut and locked, and he had men situated at high points who then begin to rain down fire on them, basically slaughtering them where they are. Now, I know you might be thinking this is rather harsh. Later on, we're going to find out what happens when an Ottoman Sultan doesn't do that with the Janissaries, which would have been kind of the analogous situation. Now, as far as the ulama, you can't just have them killed, right? That would just probably bring about a national uprising. What he does do to undermine their authority is he basically takes over the various Waqf properties, right? These Islamic foundations that were very often the source of wealth and prestige for members of the ulama, and he nationalizes them. He also nationalizes a great deal of privately owned land, which effectively undermines the aristocracy or land-owning elite. But more importantly, this now means that the state has a monopoly over this land, and he's going to use this land to raise one crop, cotton. Recognizing that cotton is a highly desired commodity in Europe, particularly in Britain, where the Industrial Revolution is getting underway. You have a large number of textile manufacturers who would be quite happy to buy cotton from the Egyptians, and so that's who he's going to sell it to. And he wants to use the revenue raised by growing this commodity crop in order to fund the reforms that he wants to do. This is going to prove pretty effective, but what's kind of unfortunate is, rather than developing industry at home, he's basically converting Egypt into a commodity-producing state that really focuses on only one commodity. And this is actually, in a sense, almost anticipating what will be the colonial relationship between European states and their colonies, right? Where the colonies exist to provide two basic things: raw materials and markets. So in a sense, Muhammad Ali is actually voluntarily developing Egypt in this direction. Having said that, he is able to collect the revenue that he wants. And some of the developments related to this are helping to improve the economy in Egypt. There is some kind of local industry, though that is mostly geared towards producing things for his army, right? For producing uniforms, also factories for producing munitions. With respect to cotton production, there are tremendous improvements in terms of agriculture, with new canals and roads being built, kind of introducing new tools and fertilizers. He does triple production. And there are some other kinds of institutions he develops, a few educational institutions, because, the kind of reforms he wants, he's going to need at least some educated bureaucrats who will help carry them out, and a teaching hospital. Now, as far as Muhammad Ali is concerned, he would really prefer that anyone going abroad to study stick to technical subjects. He doesn't want them learning about, ideas about democracy or, liberal notions related to representative government and nationalism. But the problem is, even if you go over there only to learn, kind of more technical subjects related to science, military technology, what have you. In order to do that, you needed to learn European languages, primarily French, but later on English and German. Once you learn the European languages, right, then you have access to books on other subjects. And so we're going to start to see the beginning of influence in this regard, right, in terms of possibilities of political reform and so forth. And many of these students who go abroad are really hugely impressed by what they see. I mean, certainly about what they're learning in terms of scientific advancement, but many are really impressed by a lot of the political changes that are happening in Europe at the time, particularly in Paris, right? This kind of a development of nationalism, a sense of civic duty, of patriotism, and many of them are thinking this is something that we need to bring back home to change the mentality of Egyptian people. Now, one figure that really stands out in this regard is a fellow named Rifa'a Fafi el-Tahtawi, who actually is not really a student. He goes to Paris as a chaperone, as a teacher, but also a scholar. So beginning in 1826, he's going to spend 5 years in Paris, looking out for a group of Egyptian students, but of course he's also learning while he's there. And he is especially impressed by a lot of what he sees. Now, to be clear, he doesn't like everything, but he's going to write about a lot of what he sees and think about, how some of this might be applied back home. Some of it that he feels is really entirely compatible with Islamic values. Even kind of a sense that, maybe we kind of got off track. This kind of reminds me, about, what Islam is supposed to be about. When he comes back later on, he'll be appointed head of a state language school and a translation bureau in Cairo, right? So kind of recognizing that the first step is helping people to learn European languages so that they can access learning from Europe, but then in the meantime trying to translate as much of that European learning into Arabic. And he will play a very central role in bringing Western science and methods to Egypt.